Survey research. A survey is really a form of data collection that involves the development of a questionnaire. It's usually quantitative, and you're usually using a set of questions to measure a specific set of variables or a variable, depending on the design of your study. You administer the questionnaire to a specific sample. You record and collect the data and then analyze the response. Health services research, surveys are one of the most common means of collecting data, and it's used widely in a variety of different fields. Survey research today is also big business. It employs many people, both full-time and part-time. It can be used in basic research and applied research. There are many steps that the researcher goes through in planning a survey, from deciding on the research question to choosing the format, if you're using an interview, what kind of interview, if you're using a self-administered survey, editing your questions, the order you present your questions, pilot testing your instrument, and choosing a sampling strategy. So you can see it's not a simple process. It's a complex process to do it properly and correctly in terms of research methodology. There are so many different types of technologies now associated with survey research. You can do computer-generated surveys. I think we talked about SurveyMonkey before. There are all types of voice recognition software. So the options are really quite broad and expansive. So you really need to think about what the objectives are that you have and the best way to format and plan your survey. There are many strengths of using survey research. Certainly it's an extremely useful tool in describing the characteristics of a large population. It makes reaching out to a large sample very possible and cost effective, and there are many different topics you can address through survey research. As with most things, there are also some weaknesses associated with survey research. It's really a quantitative approach, so you miss maybe some of the contextual or richness of social life, some of the qualitative components. It's somewhat artificial in terms of assessing behaviors, and there may be threats to validity as well. There are several steps involved in conducting a survey. It is a deductive process. So it's quantitative in nature. You begin with a research problem. You will have reviewed the literature, selected your unit of analysis. You compose your instrument, select how you want to do it. Is it an interview? Is it self-administered? Are you going to use electronic means for delivery? Is it paper and pencil? You choose your sampling design, who's going to fill out the survey, how are you going to select those people. We always get IRB approval before we do any type of research. It has to be approved by the Internal Review Board, which its job is to protect human participants, have to administer the survey, and then of course process the data. There are multiple design issues involved in composing a survey, from the length of the questions to the order of the questions, the actual layout and format, how you're going to deal with non-responses or refusals, how you're going to deal with a low response rate, what you can do to increase that response rate. Sometimes people give incentives, and there's some, drawbacks to that as well. Will you send out a second survey? Will you send out a reminder? If the survey is not complete, do you throw out the whole survey, or do you only omit those questions that are not complete? So again, it's not as straightforward as it appears. It can be very complex, and many of these decisions you have to make before you administer the survey. Composing a survey is a real art. It's not only what the survey questions consist of, but it's the manner in which they're presented so that they're not threatening. that it entices the respondent to answer, that there's a sense of anonymity, so that people want to give honest answers. And again, it's always good to pilot test your questions, because what may seem very clear to you may not seem very clear to someone else. You have to consider the types of questions and the response categories that you want to use. Are you going to use contingency questions? If the answer to this is yes, continue to question 2. If the answer is no, continue to question 3. Are you going to use open or closed-ended questions? Are you going to use agree, disagree, or some type of rankings? So all of these things have to be considered when you design your survey. There are several principles to use in terms of writing good questions. You want to have several questions that are measuring your variables, so you have a valid and reliable measure. You want the questions to flow smoothly. And the other thing to keep in mind is that each person who responds to your survey brings to that survey their own experience, their own life story, their own background, and so they may interpret the questions differently depending on their life history. So that's something to keep in mind. There are some things you want to avoid in terms of writing your questions, in terms of the use of language or jargons, abbreviations. You want to be very clear and concise. You want to avoid emotional language or bias in your questioning, and you want to avoid double-barreled questions. Again, it's a real art in terms of writing survey questions, because you don't want to lead the respondent to answer in a certain way. You want to elicit honest and truthful responses. You want to be sure your responses are clear, that you're not using double negatives, that the questions aren't confusing. All of these considerations must be taken into account. And again, you can see this can be a very complex and time-consuming process. Every instrument has an advantage and disadvantage, so you really need to think about what those are in the context of your research study and your target population. Surveys that are self-administered may be relatively inexpensive, may be easy to distribute to large samples. You may use a service like SurveyMonkey so that you are able to reach a large group. They're anonymous, which can promote honest responses. So these are considerations. However, investigator-administered questionnaires usually have a higher response rate because there's a vested interest and a personal interchange there. But you may trade off a sense of anonymity and decrease the quality of the responses that you get. So you really have to consider both sides. Interviewing is an art, and it's not easy to do. It's walking a fine line between establishing rapport with the interviewee, but not leading the interviewee into certain responses. It's promoting the conversation without taking it over, getting cooperation but still being able to remain neutral and unbiased. And this sometimes is very difficult to do. Most interviewers for research studies go through special training, so they approach the interview in the same manner, ask questions in the same way, trying to neutralize any biases or differences so that it doesn't affect the responses that are obtained. And again, you as a researcher really have to weigh the pros and cons of the expense and time of doing a face-to-face interview versus a self-administered interview. There are trade-offs, and you have to weigh what will work best for your particular situation and your specific study. It used to be that mail was a very common form of survey research. You send out questionnaires in the mail with a stamped addressed envelope, and it was returned to you. With the use of the internet and SurveyMonkey, this has become more or less obsolete, although it's still used, but it can be quite costly because you're looking at postage not only for sending out the surveys, but for the respondents returning them. And generally, the response rate is not as high as the electronic venue now is. You have to assess whether you want to administer a survey to a very large group at one time in one setting, as opposed to doing a more individual focus, looking at response rates, cost, resources. So many of these things really come down to logistics in terms of time, money, personnel, and resources. Again, telephone interviews have not become as common as they once were due to the no-call lists, access, people having cell phones. There was a famous study done in the 1950s that was done by telephone survey that had a severe threat of selection bias to internal validity, because at that time only certain people were able to afford phones. There weren't very many phones in all households, so they really selected a very biased sample for their study. Of course, now everyone not only has a telephone, but some people only have cell phones, so that's another consideration. If you have the time, the money, and the resources, there are some real advantages to face-to-face in terms of quality of data, being able to explore topics further, ensuring that the person you're interviewing is the one who's responding, and developing that personal rapport, which may lead to a richness and depth of responses that you may not be able to obtain in a self-administered survey. But again, it's very expensive, very time-consuming, and you have to weigh the pros and cons. It's very important that your survey convey a message to the participants, that it's professional, that you have proofread it. You certainly don't want to have any spelling errors or grammar errors. It's very important to pilot test it to ensure that it's clear to the respondent what you're asking. And you also want to practice how you're going to code your responses so you can analyze your data. There are several ethical issues involved in survey research, as there are in most types of research. There are issues related to privacy and confidentiality, being a voluntary participant as opposed to some form of coercion, the misuse of surveys, and the reporting of surveys that are not serving their purpose or not consistent with the intent of the research. The researcher must consider how they're going to choose a sample for their survey. We'll talk about this next in the chapter on sampling, whether you're going to use a random sample, which is a probability method, or a convenience sample, which is a non-probability method, and how that will affect your conclusions. If you're using a random sample, you may be able to generalize the results. If not, then you may not, because you'll be introducing bias by the fact of sampling or selection interaction. As in all research, you want to be sure that you obtain informed consent, that you're not targeting vulnerable groups or minors, that the instructions are clear, that if there are any upsetting questions on the survey, that you're providing services for debriefing, and that the responses are confidential in nature. And again, whether you generalize your results or not is really based on the sampling strategy that you employ. If you're able to get a representative sample, then you may be able to generalize your results to the larger population and minimize the bias. And then finally, once you have administered your surveys and you've collected all the data, you need to analyze it. And there are many ways to summarize your data. You might be using descriptive statistics to do that, and we'll talk about those in great detail later in the course, or inferential statistics if you're going to be drawing conclusions or inferring relationships or generalizing the results to the larger population. Descriptive statistics can be used to describe your data in terms of measures of central tendency, mean, the mode, the median. You may be looking at correlation or relationships between the variables. You may be looking at frequencies or percentages. There are all kinds of tables and charts that you can use to display this type of data. If you are using interval or ratio data, you might be using inferential statistics, and that is you might be looking